So hello everyone, and thank you for joining us on this beautiful Thursday evening. This is a public meeting to provide information related to two privately initiated urban boundary expansion applications in the city of Hamilton. Go to the next slide, Scott. So before we begin, I want to start by acknowledging that the city of Hamilton is situated upon the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas. This land is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which was an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabeg to share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. We further acknowledge that this land is covered by the Between the Lakes Purchase of 1792, between the Crown and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Today, the city of Hamilton is home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we recognize that we must do more to learn about the rich history of this land so that we can better understand our roles as residents, neighbors, partners, and caretakers. Next slide, Scott. So this virtual meeting tonight is to provide information related to two privately initiated urban boundary expansion applications. After providing some general background information, we will start with the application for the Whitechurch lands. Around 8 p.m., we will change gears and shift the application for the Elfrida lands. We will provide an opportunity to ask questions for each application separately. I want to highlight that there is a lot of information to get through this evening, and there are a lot of attendees eager to ask questions. We will not be able to answer every question that is received tonight. However, all of the questions and comments received through this process will be reviewed and considered in the upcoming staff report. Move to the next slide, Scott. So this meeting is to inform the public of the application materials provided by the applicants and give an opportunity for the public to provide comments and ask questions before staff complete our comprehensive review of the submitted materials and compile a recommendation report. This meeting will be recorded, and the recording and presentation materials will be posted to the city's Urban Boundary Expansion webpage. Participants' cameras and microphones will remain off throughout the meeting. If you are experiencing difficulties, please reach out to urbanboundary@hamilton.ca and we will do our best to get you online as quickly as possible. Next slide. We will be using the question and answer or Q&A feature this evening. After seeing the information presented, if you have a question or comment, we encourage you to use this function. Please ensure that your questions and comments are clear, polite, and concise. Questions will be reviewed by the moderators, consolidated where appropriate, and shared with the presenters for their response. It is very likely we will not be able to answer every question tonight. However, as previously mentioned, all questions and comments will be reviewed and considered when compiling the staff recommendation report, which will be presented to Planning Committee on June 25th. If your question is not answered this evening, or you have new comments or questions following this meeting, you are encouraged to send an email to urbanboundary@hamilton.ca. To ensure your comments can be considered prior to the finalization of the staff recommendation report, please submit them by April 28th. Go to the next slide. So thank you for bearing with me through this administrative preamble and our slow wait to get started. I also want to preemptively thank all of you for attending this meeting and contributing to the conversation we are having this evening. The QR codes on the screen will take you to the materials for each application on the City of Hamilton website. On this call, we have several city staff from various groups involved in the review of these applications to help answer your questions. At this time, I'm going to hand the meeting over to Dave Hayworth, Director and Strategic Advisor for Strategic Growth Initiative, for tonight's feature presentation.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Neil. Next slide, Scott. I want to thank everyone for their attendance this evening. It is really important. I'm going to speak a little bit about the Urban Boundary Expansion Framework as some general background before we get into more details on the applications and policies. While the City Council has stayed committed to not expanding its urban boundary, recent changes introduced by the Ontario government through the new provincial planning statement and Bill 185 now allow private landowners to apply for urban boundary expansions of any size and for such applications to be appealed for a city denial or non-decision on the application. Additionally, final decisions on these applications may not rest with the City Council, but upon appeal by the Ontario Land Tribunal. In response, the city has developed a draft framework to guide how it will review applications, which if approved by council will establish a clear and diligent process for reviewing urban boundary expansion applications while ensuring transparency and providing opportunities for public input. The draft framework has three parts. Part A sets out more rigorous submission requirements for applications, including technical studies tailored to urban boundary expansions, such as a housing needs assessment. Part B lists what the city will consider when reviewing applications, such as whether potential flood risks are adequately addressed and how the city's infrastructure, transportation, and emergency service capacity would be affected by the proposed development. Part C outlines the full process for submitting and reviewing applications, including opportunities for public input, all within the 120-day timeline for review that is required by the province. Council adopted staff's recommendations on April 16, 2025, including amendments to the urban and rural official plan to enshrine the requirements of the framework into policy. Notice of the adoption of the official plan amendments will be issued shortly, following which there is a 20-day window in which appeals to the Ontario Land Tribunal may be submitted before the official plan amendments are final and binding. Because the applications for Whitechurch and Elfrida were submitted before the framework was formally adopted, the city will be challenged on applying it to these developments outright. However, the framework is still helping guide staff as they review the two proposals. Next slide. The infographic on the screen outlines the application submission and review process as detailed in Section C of the draft framework. The applications for Whitechurch and Elfrida were deemed complete by mid-March 2025, triggering the city's 120-day review timeline. This means the city has until early July to make a decision. If no decision is made by then, the applications can be appealed to the Ontario Land Tribunal, which is the provincial body that adjudicates land use planning matters. Similarly, if council refuses the applications, the applicants may appeal the decision to the Ontario Land Tribunal. Next slide. As of today, the city has received 4 applications to expand the urban boundary, which are outlined on the map that is currently displayed. The 20 Road West is an older application that was received in 2020 and has since been appealed to the Ontario Land Tribunal, while the Sulphur Springs application has not been deemed complete at this time. Only Whitechurch and Elfrida are being evaluated by staff at this time. Next slide. So I'm now going to speak about the Whitechurch lands application. We will begin with a brief overview of the Whitechurch lands urban boundary expansion application, followed by an overview of the Elfrida expansion application. We'll then open the floor for questions and comments. We would also like to emphasize that the information shared through this presentation about these applications reflects the perspectives of the applicants, consultants, and does not represent any current views of city staff, as staff are currently reviewing the submissions. Next slide. The Whitechurch application was submitted by the Whitechurch Landowners Group, which consists of the landowners of a large portion of the lands outlined on the slide. The approximately 364 hectares of land the applicant is seeking to bring into the urban boundary through the proposed amendment is bounded by Airport Road east to the north, Miles Road to the east, Whitechurch Road east to the south, and Upper James Street to the west. The proposed use for the site includes approximately 7,600 residential dwellings alongside commercial, institutional, and recreational uses. Next slide. Some of the existing features on the land include Southern Pines Golf and Country Club, agricultural lands, scrub lands, ponds, and woodlands, as well as single detached dwellings. The surrounding lands also include a variety of uses, including farm buildings, agricultural fields, the Mount Hope community, and single detached dwellings. Next slide. While the distribution of specific land uses will be established at a later date through a secondary planning process, a preliminary concept plan has been provided to demonstrate a potential layout for the future development of the White Church lands. The concept plan includes potential developable areas, intensification hubs, and intensification corridors, the proposed road network, potential location of transit stations, and preliminary identification of natural heritage features on the site. In addition to the low-rise residential units proposed, the concept plan indicates the addition of 3 elementary schools, 6 parks, 17 hectares of commercial land uses, 19 hectares of natural open space, and a recreational trail system. Next slide. The application proposes to amend both the rural and urban Hamilton official plans to add the lands to the urban boundary and removes the agricultural, rural, and open space designations from the site, replacing them with a new site-specific policy. While the amendment articulates a vision for the site, which includes integration with the Mount Hope community and airport employment lands, efficient land, resource, and infrastructure use, and a range and mix of land uses, particulars around this vision will need to be established through a secondary plan, which must be submitted to the city for approval if the current application is approved. Next slide. There are existing provincial and municipal policies which are used to guide the applicant's submission as well as staff's evaluation of the application. In particular, direction provided through the provincial planning statement and the city's official plan must be addressed. Section 232 of the provincial planning statement directs planning authorities to consider several impacts criteria when evaluating a settlement area boundary expansion proposal. These include whether the lands will allow for an appropriate range and mix of land uses, whether existing or planned infrastructure and public services can support the development, whether the land includes specialty crop areas or prime agricultural areas, and if an evaluation has occurred to determine whether the lower priority agricultural lands could provide an alternative location for the expansion if avoiding prime agricultural areas is not possible, whether there are ways to avoid, minimize, or mitigate any negative effects on the agricultural system, whether the proposed expansion is in compliance with the minimum distance separation requirements, which establish the distance required between livestock facilities and sensitive land uses like homes or schools, and finally, whether the proposal supports a structured progressive expansion of settlements. Next slide. The city's rural and urban official plans also provide direction on urban boundary expansion applications. As noted on the slide, both official plans include policies which encourage the maintenance of a firm urban boundary in Hamilton. They also call for managing population growth to 2051 by building in areas already planned for development, adding more housing within existing neighborhoods, and allowing limited new development in the rural parts of the city. These policies represent the city's preferred growth strategy and were established prior to the provincial policy, which now permits privately initiated urban boundary expansions. Next slide. Should the lands come into the urban boundary by a decision of council and/or the Ontario Land Tribunal, secondary planning would be required, and Section 242 of the Urban Hamilton Official Plan would provide direction to applicants as they submit their development proposals and secondary plans. These goals support the objectives of the official plan as a whole and include developing complete community, diverse housing options, integrated transportation, sustainable street design, natural heritage protection, climate adaptation, greenhouse gas emission reduction strategy, financial sustainability. Next slide. In support of their application, the White Church Landowner Groups has submitted the studies noted on the slide. The city will have peer reviews completed for the agricultural impact assessment, commercial impact analysis, financial impact analysis, land needs analysis, noise feasibility study, odor impact study, and energy and climate change assessment. Through this presentation, we will provide a brief overview of some of the key studies submitted by the applicant, which includes the opinions of their consultants. Next slide. Agriculture impact assessment identified that the site is currently used for agricultural purposes as well as recreational uses, rural residences, and commercial uses. While the proposed development is not within a specialty crop area, it is in a prime agricultural area. In spite of this, the author is of the opinion that the development would have minimal impacts on agricultural activities. It is also suggested that the future secondary planning process and subsequent planning processes will provide opportunities to ensure that impacts to the agricultural community are minimized and mitigated. Next slide. A land needs analysis was conducted on behalf of the applicant, which is intended to identify whether there is a need for additional lands to meet the current and future need for ground-related housing. Through the author's analysis, they suggest that Hamilton designated greenfield areas and built boundary can currently accommodate about 39,700 new units, but that 99,300 ground-related units will be required by 2051. These estimates are based on assumption about housing preferences across different age groups. Additionally, although construction rates suggest that 14,600 additional dwelling units will be built by 2051, the author argues that ADUs will not fully meet the demand for ground-related housing. Finally, the author bases their estimates on an anticipated 50% intensification rate as opposed to the 80% intensification rate in the city's urban official plan. Based on these assumptions, the author concludes that Hamilton will need to expand its urban boundary by about 2,386 hectares by 2051 to accommodate expected demand for ground-related housing. Next slide. A fiscal impact assessment submitted by the applicant suggests that the city will receive approximately $282 million in development charge revenue, $33.8 million in building permit fees, and $55.2 million in annual property tax and non-tax revenues. Calculated costs to the city included annual costs of $49.7 million for general operating costs, infrastructure operating costs, and infrastructure replacement costs over their life cycle. Given these estimates, the author suggests that the proposed subdivision will generate an annual surplus of $5.4 million for the city by 2041, which they assume will cover the replacement costs of the required capital infrastructure over the long term. Based on these estimates, the author argues the proposed development will have a positive fiscal impact on the city. Next slide. The submitted functional servicing report identifies that the proposed development is located in both the 20-Mile Creek and Upper Welland River watersheds. The author states sanitary servicing and water supply distribution can be accommodated through upgrades to existing infrastructure or planning of new infrastructure as part of the city's typical water and wastewater master plan update and associated development charges bylaw update. Furthermore, they suggest that stormwater outlets surrounding the site will provide sufficient capacity to service the lands, with stormwater runoff to be conveyed by storm sewers designed for a 5-year storm event. Next slide. The submitted transportation master plan study provides a limited evaluation of existing conditions and transportation needs associated with the development, but rather focuses on recommendations associated with managing transportation and transit demand. Some of these recommendations include improvements associated with accommodating bike parking and connections to the bike network, linking key destinations and providing amenities to improve walkability and reducing minimum parking requirements based on proximity to transit. Next slide. So in terms of next step, the full studies submitted by the applicant along with other materials related to the application can be viewed on our website. And we would encourage you to sign up for the urban boundary notification list using the QR code on the screen or by visiting hamilton.ca/UBE. This notification list will send email updates about the draft framework, notification of new applications when they are deemed complete, and notification of any public meetings associated with urban boundary expansion applications. In terms of next steps, you, as Neil has mentioned previously, can submit comments by April 28, 2025 to urbanboundary@hamilton.ca in order for your question, comments, or concerns to be incorporated in the recommendation report. City staff review and will do a review and analysis of all application materials and public comments and agency comments and peer review comments that we receive. Finalization of staff report to there'll be a final staff report going to planning committee and the minutes of planning committee going to council. There was a statutory public meeting at a special planning committee on June 25th, 2025, followed by a special council meeting to ratify any decisions from the planning committee. The recommendation reports will be considered after the individual public meetings are held for each application. Next slide. We will now open the floor to questions from participants. A reminder that we will be using the question and answer function in Teams to receive questions from participants. The reviewed questions will be combined when similar and shared with presenters by our moderator. Not all questions may be addressed given our time limitations, but any relevant questions that we cannot respond to during this meeting will be addressed in the city's recommendation report. The question and answer function can be accessed at the top of your screen. And with that, I will turn it over for people to submit questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. So just as people are starting to get those questions going, we have a few that have already made it in. So the first question, Dave, I'm going to send this one your way, and it's about the OLT process, what that looks like, how the city might be involved, how city staff are involved, and maybe any commentary on how the OLT will make its decision.
Yeah, well, that's a large question. If an application is appealed, it would go to the Ontario Land Tribunal. I think it partly depends on the city's position. If the city council were to deny the applications, that puts the city in a position to defend that position at the Ontario Land Tribunal. The Planning Act is currently set up not to permit third-party appeals. So the participation of the public in general or people that are outside of the subject area in terms of land holdings would their participation may be limited to like participatory status. That's something that we'd have to check with legal. Once there is an appeal in, there's you know, a general hearing to identify issues. There's sessions held at the tribunal to identify expert witnesses. City staff's role would be, you know, witnesses to some extent, depending on positions taken by staff and by council relative to different pieces of the studies and reports that are being reviewed. And then it goes to a tribunal, and the tribunal typically weighs the expert evidence provided and the policies in effect in terms of rendering a decision.
Perfect. Thank you, Dave. So I have another question here that I'm going to pose to engineering generally, and then maybe look for a transportation follow-up. Oh, I also am going to note that we are taking all the questions via message, so please pop those in the Q&A. Unfortunately, we don't have the capacity to be turning microphones on and off for everyone, so I see a few hands popping up, but if you could just direct those questions into the Q&A function. So this next question, we heard a lot about some of the studies, and Dave highlighted some of the information that we have on the specific site. Curious if someone from engineering and then maybe transportation to follow could explain a little bit about what that review looks like, particularly how it fits into the greater scope of the city and maybe some of those downstream impacts. So things like road capacity, maybe not directly on the site, but off site, and the same for water, wastewater, and other sort of functions. So maybe we can start with someone from engineering, and then we'll pass it over to transportation after.
All right, I don't mind starting this. I'm looking after the water distribution and wastewater collection review. So we are going over the FSR right now in regards to water distribution. This is all part of Pressure District 6, and we need to ensure that there is enough fire flow and water pressure down in that area. And unfortunately, the FSR right now has not completed any modeling or any water main hydraulic analysis to allow us to do that. That's being sort of pushed down the road right now, but we're reviewing the pressure district as it is, and we'll be making comments. In regards to wastewater, this area would naturally go to the new Dickinson trunk that is still under construction, which outlets to the east to the upper Centennial trunk, down the lower Centennial trunk, which is still in design, and to the Woodward treatment plant. And the Woodward treatment plant right now is being upgraded, but all of those upgrades are in relation to really the Grids 2 2051 urban boundary densification, and we would have to study the impacts on this boundary or urban boundary expansion land, and would also have to study the impacts on really the Dickinson trunk and the upper Centennial trunk, which have not been completed yet. And this land was not included in the design for those trunk sewers, so it's still quite a lot of study work to be done.
And maybe I can chime in from a stormwater point of view before we hand it off to transportation. Is similar to what Tim had said, is that has been some material submitted for review. There's, as was mentioned by Dave, these are in the headwaters of the very, very upper end of two watersheds known as the Upper Welland and Upper 20 Mile Creek. They're both in the same conservation authority, the Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority. So we're just currently reviewing all that material that's been submitted, and just noting that a lot of these water courses are quite small and very sensitive to a change in stormwater management, sort of runoff from development areas. The area is very quite flat. And so we're just concerned, and we'll be looking into that as we go through the material.
Thank you, Mark. I see it. Steve, maybe for a transportation?
Yeah.
All right.
Steve Malloy, Manager of Transportation Planning. So my team would look at the transportation impacts. So from a high level study such as this, we would look at precisely what the question asked would be the upstream and downstream impacts of the existing and planned road network at a corridor level to understand what the capacity constraints are, deficiencies, and if further impacts would be identified. In addition, and that would be based on the land uses identified and the distribution of that trips to the network. In addition, we would be looking at any opportunities of connectivity through the existing network from a multimodal perspective, so cycling networks, pedestrian networks, as well as transit networks. I will let HSR speak to transit impacts itself, but from a transportation perspective, we would look at opportunities for any mode share that could be accomplished through the existing transit network, and if that would need to be expanded in collaboration with HSR. So again, at this level, we wouldn't get down to what some people would be concerned about would be individual intersections. Should this proceed in any manner, subsequent studies would be required to drill down into those details, but we would look at it from a network perspective of what the existing capacity is and what the impacts would be.
I'll pick up on the HSR mention to close us out. I'm Nick Shalou, Manager of Transit Strategic Planning for HSR. From our perspective, both of these applications have submitted concept plans for the transit network. We compare that to what we're already planning and look at incremental costs associated with the extra buses, the extra time that's needed to service these areas, so that we can really understand how much more it will cost us to expand into these sections.
All right, thank you everyone for the wholesome response to those questions there. The next one is a planning question, so probably directed to you, Dave. In some of the submission materials online, there is a reference to some historically significant homes or other cultural heritage features. How do the submissions address that, and what might staff be looking for in those submissions?
Thanks, Neil. So phase 1 cultural heritage assessments were done, and those are being reviewed and considered relative to whether there's kind of sufficient information in those, and whether they've identified next steps appropriately to consider the protection of those. I think basically the phase 1 would flag anything that's out there. Should the applications be approved and come into the urban boundary, let's say at the OLT stage, Ontario Land Tribunal stage, part of the whole discussion at the Ontario Land Tribunal would be like, should there be certain policy conditions put on the applications to ensure things are going to get looked at. We do have secondary plan policies, which I did mention in the presentation, where come into play should the lands come into the urban boundary. Certain things are looked at. Cultural heritage would be one at the secondary plan stage, to look at it in more detail to ensure that cultural heritage is protected adequately through that planning process, which is secondary plans are sort of a blueprint for how the community would grow and develop.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to you, Dave. There's a couple questions that are popping up looking for how this current process and maybe the current urban boundary expansion applications are related to some of the previous things we've seen related to the Greenbelt and some of the former provincial changes to Hamilton's urban boundary. So can you just contextualize this within that for us?
Sure. So when the city adopted its official plan, it was based on a no urban boundary expansion growth strategy. That official plan went to the province for approval. In approving the official plan, the province modified the official plan and added lands, I think about 22 hectares roughly, of land into the urban boundary through that exercise. That has since been reversed. Those lands that were added by the province approving the official plan were reversed and removed from the urban boundary expansion through Bill 150. So as I mentioned in the presentation, there has been changes in provincial legislation after that. One, to the provincial planning statement that allows urban expansions to proceed privately outside of a municipal comprehensive review, which is a review done by the city. as well as appeal their applications through Bill 185 that allowed municipalities or applicants to appeal a non-decision or denial of an application. So that's kind of the history on the urban boundary expansions relative to the official plan. These lands are outside of the Greenbelt plan. They're in what's called the White Belt between the urban area and the Greenbelt plan boundary. The changes the province made in terms of removing lands from the Greenbelt plan, that was in a sense somewhat separate from the official plan, and those changes have been reversed by the province as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Dave. I'm going to come back to you one more time. This is two separate questions, but they are related. So the first part is about the peer review process and who is actually doing that work, what their relationship is to city staff, and what that looks like as far as the recommendation goes. And then the second but related part is, should this application or other applications get to the OLT, is the city limited to in-house staff, or are there other experts who might be called on the city's behalf as well?
Okay, so peer reviews are being done by consultants with expertise in those fields. They're actually hired by the city. The cost of the peer review is paid for by the consultant, but the city is actually hiring those peer review consulting firms to look at those applications, and they discuss the applications with staff in terms of review timelines, expectations, etc., with staff. And can you repeat the second part, Neil? Sorry.
So the question was about, should this get to the OLT, is the city limited to using in-house staff to defend the position, or is there the opportunity to have some of those experts be called as witnesses as well?
Yeah, so there's an opportunity to have experts called as witnesses outside of city staff. Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. I have a general question that I'm going to pose to the group. I feel Dave might want to chime in, and Tim, you might also have some context here as well. It's a fairly, I think, a question on a lot of people's mind. Is the city of Hamilton concerned about paying for the infrastructure that would be required? And then I'll add a second part to that. How do these submission materials maybe alleviate, or how can the city be reviewing these materials to have an understanding of that cost?
So I'll go first, and Tim, you can follow me on this if you wish. But yes, we are concerned about the fiscal costs of infrastructure, where we want to analyze whether there's sufficient existing or planned capacity, which is a provincial planning statement criteria for us to look at. But what are the costs and ramifications of all that have to be looked at. So one of the reasons we required a fiscal impact assessment from the applicants, which is being reviewed by staff as well as being peer reviewed.
I also see a hand from Gavin, so maybe we'll go there next.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. Gavin Norman, Manager of Infrastructure Planning in the Growth Management Division in Planning and Economic Development Department. The concept of who's paying for infrastructure. Recently, the City of Hamilton passed its latest development charges bylaw, which clearly indicates infrastructure required for growth, and in this case, growth required for the build out of the city within the current urban boundary. There's also specific policy statements within the development charges bylaw that suggests any infrastructure required to support any growth outside the current existing urban boundary is not covered by development charges, being the city is not paying for any of that infrastructure. So at least at this point, council's position is that any growth outside of the current urban boundary would be paid for by the developers.
Thank you, Gavin. I think that wraps up that question. There's a few questions about anticipated timelines, and particularly some folks who are asking if they own lands in the affected area but are not part of the ownership group, when might they see progress or see things happening down the line? I know Erin has provided some high-level comments in her FAQ document that is posted in the published section, and some responses to some individual questions, but maybe Dave, just for the wider group, we can have that conversation as well.
Sure. If you're a landowner within the subject area of the application and you're interested in development, as I mentioned, should there be an approval for the lands to come into the urban boundary, and that's finalized, the subject area, the planning for that area, the next stage would be a secondary plan being developed, as well as incorporating finalization of some sub-watershed planning. Phase 2, there would be several other studies that would be done in association with that secondary plan to get into more detail. But again, that secondary plan would be, in a sense, a blueprint for how that community would grow and develop, with the vision and laid out land uses and policies, etc. That would be done before you get into, plans of subdivision and zoning, etc.
Thank you. So this one will be a question for our stormwater folks. So earlier there was a mention of a 5-year storm being part of the review for the stormwater sewers and the capacity within the system. I'm wondering if we could maybe unpack that a little bit, and particularly some of these questions are asking around climate change and sort of increasingly severe and more frequent storm events.
So I could start with that. Mark Hartley, the Senior Engineer for Stormwater Management in the Infrastructure Planning Group with Growth Management and Planning, the PED Department. As far as, I think the best way to answer this would be to say that there are provincial standards with respect to stormwater management design that are used, as well as city standards. And just at this stage of the game, I think it's just safe to say that those standards will be used. They did mention the 5-year storm, which is part of the standards, yes, but part of the process as well would be to look at a broader number of events as part of the process, and including sort of impact on climate change. So as part of the submission, it will be expected that they'll look at all those events. So not just that single event.
I think, just to add to that, Mark, I think it'd be fair to say, like, as a standard requirement of design of storm sewers in the city today is we designed to the 5-year storm or the 5-year event. And I think that so any sewer that you see on or don't see that, but is on a street that you may live on or may be driving on, is sized to the 5-year event, and anything greater than that is then handled in a way where there might be surcharging of storm sewers. But ultimately, we also plan for major events like the 100-year event, the Hurricane Hazel type of event, with overland flow routes, and for the most part, our road network and natural outlets like creeks and rivers, things like that, provide that outlet for overland flow. So that terminology of 5-year sewers is very, very technical, but it is the basis for which all storm sewer systems are designed, at least in Ontario.
Thank you for that, Gavin and Mark. The next question is a planning question, and it relates to the White Belt. So the White Belt is an area that acts as a buffer between the existing urban boundary, the Greenbelt lands, and sort of the wider agricultural community that surrounds Hamilton. How does the submission and staff's review of the submission look to minimize or avoid land use conflicts between these urban uses and agricultural uses that may be existing in the area?
So Neil, I can answer that from a high level. Both applications, and this is again the perspective from the applicant's consultant that completed the agricultural impact assessment, which staff are still in the review stage. But those agricultural impact assessments speak to agricultural mitigation measures such as edge planning, use of subdivision design, density and lot patterns at the periphery areas, building design and layout, open space and landscape design towards the periphery, urban side buffer design, trail systems, as well as, those types of mitigation measures being looked at in more detail at the secondary plan stage area. And again, those are the viewpoints of the applicant's consultant, and we are reviewing those assessments, and we're also having them peer reviewed.
Thank you, Dave. There's been a few questions that have also popped up, and I'm not sure who on the call is actually best to answer, so I'm going to put it out generally, and feel free to jump in, staff, if you're the one. Asking about private wells that exist within these areas, and where in the review those might be accounted for, and what potential protection measures might look like.
Do you want to take that, Mark, or even Jim? Otherwise,
Sure.
I can. Go ahead, Mark.
Well, sure. Well, I heard the word wells, so private wells. So that puts me into the category of source water protection, and what's similar to our last response in terms of what guidelines are available to be able to speak to that. There are quite strict guidelines in the province with respect to source water protection. So that this is sort of a groundwater hydrogeology question, if I heard right, about wells, and that would be their drinking water supply. So that needs to be also part of the review of the material to make sure that, everyone's water supply is protected.
Thank you, Mark. We have another question here, getting into sort of the background of, we have these new reports from the developers suggesting there's a land shortage. There have been previous stances from staff and the city that may or may not be the case. Dave, could you provide a little bit of context into maybe some of those previous opinions that were shared by staff and some of the regulatory changes that have led to this situation?
Sure, thanks, Neil. So from a high level perspective, there was work done for the official plan before it was adopted under Grids 2. And that work was done under the growth plan and provincial policy statements. As that work was done, there was the ambitious density scenario of, I think, 60% intensification that was laid out, which proposed, based on that intensification, an urban boundary expansion. And it was all done according to provincial methodology under those planning documents. Council chose a position of no urban boundary expansion and an increased intensification rate. I want to say too that what's important is, while the staff work at the time identified a certain hectarage of area for expansion, it didn't necessarily identify the areas for expansion and what the phasing or priority of areas coming into the urban boundary should be from a locational perspective in that regard. Since that time, the growth plan and the provincial policy statements have been replaced by the provincial planning statement. The provincial methodology used at the time is not there specific formally anymore. And so there's also been some changes relative to legislation. The provincial planning statement indicates that municipalities shall use the Ministry of Finance numbers in their planning with adjustments as they deem fit. And until that time, though, until the new official plan is updated, or the existing official plan is updated, municipalities can continue to use the growth numbers that are in their official plans. That's what we've chosen to do, because the Ministry of Finance numbers, although they're out and they're higher numbers than what's in our official plan, they don't account for aspects like the reduction in immigration, etc. So we're waiting to see the next version to see what impacts they have. The applicants in their land supply analysis have used Ministry of Finance numbers. And we're taking a look at all that. The provincial planning statement indicates planning authorities shall use those numbers, and I've already indicated that we would do that in their next official plan review. Since the staff position on grids 2 as well, and council's position on no urban boundary expansion and, growth through intensification within the existing urban area, the city's been working on various projects to help facilitate intensification, such as, facilitating the establishment of accessory dwelling units, increasing the housing types and densities for low density residential zones, as well as now looking into medium density residential zones. So the city's been working away on facilitating, completing planning projects to facilitate that intensification strategy. All that has to be looked at by staff. There's some peer reviews going on of the applicant's work, and we'll arrive at an analysis and position at the recommendation report.
Thank you, Dave. Just looking at the clock, we probably have time for one more question on this application before we get into the next application. For those of you who have questions that maybe have overlap, there will be another Q&A period. We will be able to get through some additional questions then. But I do have a question here, and there's been a few on this, and how expanding the urban boundary has a permanent effect on the agricultural lands in the area. Can we have a bit of a conversation about what is being reviewed and considered by the city when we're making this decision that would lead to this permanent loss of agricultural lands and may disrupt other factors of the agricultural system?
So Neil, I guess I'll answer that in the sense, as I mentioned, and in the presentation, there's an agricultural impact assessment that's been completed for both applications, which looks at like what is the impact on agriculture in the subject area and the area around, and that has to be reviewed by staff, where that's in the review stage, and it's being peer reviewed as well. And also what comes into play, should lands come into the urban boundary and by an approval, let's say at the Ontario Land Tribunal, the next stage is secondary planning. And also what would have to be worked out is the phasing of development and over what time. And that's likely going to come up in any discussions to some extent in our review of for the recommendation report, but also in any decision making, let's say at the Land Tribunal if the application's appealed there. So through phasing, all this land is not going to develop, in 2 years at one time. So agricultural activities would continue or could continue as development proceeds or is phased in those areas as well. That's just something I want to note as well. But overall, it's a lot of the work will be based on the review of the agricultural impact assessment and the peer review and taking all that into consideration.
Perfect. Thank you, Dave. So we have turned the clock over to 8 p.m., which was our target time to shift gears and start the presentation for the Elfrida lands. So if there's anyone on the call who is joining just for the White Church application, we are now shifting to Elfrida. As mentioned, there will be another opportunity for questions and answers following this presentation. And recognizing that some of the questions we haven't got to yet are general in nature. Some of them may also be answered in that second round. So we encourage you to stay tuned and to hang on to those questions until we get to that phase, and we'll do our best to keep answering a wide variety of questions. For those of you who might be leaving us, and we're only interested in the White Church application, I again want to encourage everyone whose questions maybe weren't answered. If you have outstanding comments, or if you've had an opportunity to review some of the materials that are available online and you're seeking clarification, please do reach out to urbanboundary@hamilton.ca, and the team will do their best to respond to those. And any comments received prior to April 28th will be considered in the staff recommendation report. So with that, we'll close the Q&A for the White Church lands, and we'll shift the presentation over to Elfrida.
Great, thanks, Neil. We would also like to once again emphasize that the information shared through this presentation about these applications reflects the perspectives of the applicant's consultants and does not represent the views of city staff at this time who are currently reviewing the submissions. Next slide. The Elfrida application was submitted by the Elfrida Community Builders Group, which consists of the landowners of a large portion of the lands outlined on the slide. The approximately 1,209 hectares of land the applicant is seeking to bring into the urban boundary through the proposed amendment is bounded by Second Road and Henderson Road to the east, Golf Club Road to the south, Trinity Church Road to the southwest, and an east-west hydro corridor to the northwest. Swayze Road and Upper Centennial Parkway to the northwest, and Mud Street to the north. The proposed use of the site includes approximately 114,900 people and 14,360 jobs at 135 persons and jobs per hectare. Next slide. Some of the existing features on the land include a hydro corridor, which separates the southern part of the site from the urban areas to the north, natural heritage features, rural roads, commercial, employment, industrial, and institutional uses, agricultural uses, as well as about 148 residential dwellings. Next slide. While the distribution of specific land uses will be established at a later date through a secondary planning process, again, that's as proposed by the application. If the application obtains approval to be in the urban area, a preliminary concept plan has been provided to demonstrate a potential layout for the future development of the Elfrida lands. The concept plan includes approximately 78 hectares of natural heritage and associated linkage areas, development based on the existing road network, both high and low density development areas, and an intensification hub, a proposed linear greenway for recreational use, and additional roads that connect to transit stations and hubs. Next slide. The application proposes to amend both the rural and urban Hamilton official plans to add the lands to the urban boundary and designate the site as urban expansion area neighborhoods. The amendment also articulates a vision for the site outlines the specific content of the secondary plan and includes policies for the lands bound by Rymel Road, Swayze Road, and the former Highway 56 that are presently occupied by dry industrial and commercial uses by restricting the uses to those currently existing and permitted. Next slide. The amendment also specifies that the minimum density target for the lands will align with the policies from the Urban Hamilton official plan, outlines a set of goals for the development, and outlines a list of plans, reports, and studies that will be submitted as part of the required secondary plan as outlined on this slide. Next slide. There are existing provincial municipal policies which are used to guide the applicant's submission as well as staff's evaluation of the application. And I'm going to repeat some of this as repetition for what we spoke about at the Whitechurch application. In particular, direction provided through the provincial planning statement and the city's official plan must be addressed. Section 232 of the provincial planning statement directs planning authorities to consider several impacts when evaluating a settlement area boundary expansion proposal. These include whether the lands will allow for an appropriate range and mix of land uses, whether existing or planned infrastructure and public services can support development, whether the lands includes specialty crop areas or prime agricultural areas, and if an evaluation has occurred to determine whether lower priority agricultural lands could provide an alternative location for the expansion if avoiding prime agricultural areas is not possible, whether there are ways to avoid, minimize, or mitigate any negative effects on the agricultural system, whether the proposed expansion is in compliance with the minimum distance separation requirement which establish the distance required between livestock facilities and sensitive land uses like homes or schools. And finally, whether the proposal supports a structured progressive expansion of settlements. Next slide. The city's rural and urban official plans also provide direction on urban boundary expansion applications. As noted on the slide, both official plans include policies which encourage the maintenance of a firm urban boundary in Hamilton. They also call for managing population growth to 2051 by building in areas already planned for development, adding more housing within existing neighborhoods, and allowing limited new development in the rural parts of the city. These policies represent City Council's preferred growth strategy and were established prior to the provincial policy, which now permits privately initiated urban boundary expansion applications. Next slide. Should the lands come into the urban boundary by a decision of council and or the Ontario Land Tribunal, secondary planning would be required, and Section 242 of the Urban Hamilton official plan would provide direction to applicants as they submit their development proposals and secondary plans. These goals support the objectives of the official plan as a whole and include developing complete communities, diverse housing options, integrated transportation, sustainable street design, natural heritage protection, climate adaptation, greenhouse gas emission reduction strategies, financial sustainability. Next slide. In support of their application, the Elfrida Community Builders Group has submitted the studies noted on the slide. The city will have peer reviews completed for the agricultural impact assessment, financial impact analysis, land needs analysis, noise feasibility study, odor impact study, and energy and climate change assessment. Through this presentation, we'll provide a brief overview of some of the key studies submitted by the applicant, which includes the opinions of their consultants. Next slide. The agricultural impact assessment identified that the site is not within a specialty crop area, but is in a prime agricultural area. The author claims that avoiding prime agricultural areas is not feasible to meet the city's land needs for projected population growth, and that the primary impacts to the lands are limited to the loss of prime agricultural land, cultivable land, agricultural infrastructure, and land improvements, while indirect impacts are expected to be negligible with the implementation of mitigation measures. Finally, the author also claims the proposed development can comply with minimum distance separation requirements, which establish the distance required between livestock facilities and sensitive land uses like homes or schools. It is important to note, however, that 4 agricultural operations create setback requirements and impact approximately 10.35 hectares of the lands. Next slide. Land needs and housing assessment report. A land needs analysis was also conducted on behalf of the applicant, which is intended to identify if there is a need to plan for additional land to accommodate an appropriate range and mix of housing to 2051. Through the author's analysis, they suggest that Hamilton will need an additional 136,900 households by 2051, which is 26,580 more than was identified through the 2021 land needs assessment. The author did elect to develop their estimates based on the Ontario Ministry of Finance population forecasts rather than the growth plan projections, which form the basis of the city's official plan projections. As a result, the author estimates a shortfall of 23,830 single semi-detached units and 14,780 row units by 2051, which they project will require 1,780 additional hectares of land intended to accommodate residential development. Next slide. A fiscal impact assessment submitted by the applicant suggests that the city will receive approximately $1.71 billion in development charges from the developer, which they project will exceed the capital infrastructure costs identified for the proposed development. They also note that the responsibility for stormwater, linear water, and wastewater infrastructure within the development will be absorbed by the developer. Based on these estimates, the author argues the proposed development will have a positive fiscal impact on the city. Next slide. The submitted functional servicing report recognizes that previous water system upgrades that were completed in relation to the subject lands were designed for a population of 41,558 residents and 3,525 jobs, while updated projections for the proposed development anticipate 114,903 residents and 14,363 jobs, representing a 70% increase in servicing demands. The author suggests that future discussions with city staff will occur to understand how the increase in the anticipated water demands may impact proposed water infrastructure projects in the city. However, these discussions have not yet happened. Similarly, the author states that the site can be serviced through the extension of existing utilities, including hydro, gas, cable, TV, and telephone, though applications to each service provider will be required to confirm capacity of existing services. Next slide. Consequently, the report recommends in terms of the functional servicing study and stormwater management plan be prepared during the secondary plan phase. In terms of transportation assessment, the transportation assessment states that a total of 27,762 morning vehicular trips and 32,644 evening trips to and from the lands are expected. The initial analysis showed that traffic on Trinity Church Road and Mud Street would exceed capacity. However, the author suggests that a continuous grid-like collector system within the development will help manage traffic flow. The author anticipates that truck routes will continue operating along existing arterial roads and will be supplemented by planned arterial roads. As shown in the map on the slide, the assessment suggests that transit stops can be supported at arterial intersections, offering a 400-meter transit coverage for a large portion of the development. Further details about transportation strategies are deferred to the secondary planning stage. Next slide. The full study submitted by the applicant along with other materials related to the application can be viewed on our website. And we would also encourage you to sign up for the urban boundary notification list using the QR code on the screen or by visiting hamilton.ca/UBE. This notification list will send email updates about the draft urban boundary expansion framework, notification of new applications when they are deemed complete, and notification of any public meetings associated with urban boundary expansion applications. In terms of next steps, you have the opportunity to provide and submit questions, comments, or concerns related to the applications by April 28, 2025 to urbanboundary@hamilton.ca in order to be, incorporated and reflected in the recommendation report. You still have the opportunity to comment after that date and at the public meeting in June. That information just wouldn't be incorporated into the report. City staff review and analyze all of the application materials and comments. There'll be a final recommendation report to planning committee and then council. It'll be a special planning committee. The special planning committee will be held on June 25th, followed subsequently right after a special council meeting to ratify any decisions of the planning committee. A public meeting for each application will be held on June 25th as well, and then the recommendation reports considered after. Next slide. We will now open the floor to questions from participants. A reminder that we'll be using the Q&A function in Teams to receive questions from participants. The received questions will be combined when similar and shared with the presenters by our moderator. Not all questions may be addressed given our time limitations, but any relevant questions that we cannot respond to during this meeting will be addressed, as I mentioned, in and incorporated for council's consideration in the recommendation report. The Q&A function can be accessed at the top of your screen once you click on it. And we clarify that we will not be taking questions verbally, and as such, the raise the hand function should not be used. And I just open it up for questions at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. We have some questions starting to populate, and we have one holdover that I'm going to start with because I think it is pertinent to both discussions, and it's about natural features that are on the lands currently and what protections those might have and if they can be saved is the language used in the question.
Jim Harnham, project manager of stormwater management. I'll start it off and then possibly Dave or Mark can continue from there. For both applications, sub-watershed study or similar document was provided which evaluates or analyzes those natural features and kind of the impacts that the development may potentially have on those. We're currently still in the process of reviewing those sub-watershed studies and associated documents and gathering those comments together. But per the draft urban boundary expansion framework that Dave had shared earlier, we do have a list of considerations, and those natural features and natural hazards are the considerations that we're taking into account when evaluating these applications.
Thank you, Jim. I'm not sure if you have any context to add, Dave.
No, I would just add that Jim's correct on that, obviously. As we review it, what will come out is when we review the actual official plan amendment that accompanies it, was there sufficient policy direction or protection to say if we're approved, there's a policy at this stage where the urban boundary expansion comes in where these areas are definitely going to be protected at the secondary plan stage, right? And that might be an issue that would be, discussed at an Ontario Land Tribunal should the lands be approval for the lands to come into the urban boundary, what other policy requirements and criteria would be put into effect to make sure there's protection at the secondary plan stage, so that, you know, there's something to look back on and say, hey, this amendment requires the protection of those features. But as Jim mentioned, it's the framework definitely requires the consideration and analysis of the natural features to be taken into account, and it'll be assessed.
Thank you. So the next, it's a couple questions actually that have come in around the density and the population projections. As you mentioned, Dave, and we saw in some of the slides, the projection here is 135 people and jobs per hectare. And there's a few comments that seems like it's quite high. So I'm wondering if you can, one, provide some context as to how that number's arrived at within the development. And then there is sort of a follow-up question from another individual that also suggests that that might be high, and if it's possible the developers are overestimating, and how we account for that in our review.
Thanks, Neil. So for those that were listening to the Q&A for the Whitechurch application, this applicant's consultant also factored in the Ministry of Finance numbers that are out and that are referred to in the provincial planning statement, which are quite a bit higher than the city's projections in its official plan, which were used Schedule 3 of the growth plan, which has now been replaced by the provincial planning statement, which does say planning authorities shall consider the Ministry of Finance numbers in their planning, but it also indicates that until you update your official plan, which we haven't done yet, ours was not that long ago recently approved, you can use your existing official plan projections, which is what we're doing. The applicant has used the Ministry of Finance projections, which like I did say, are higher. We do know that they don't really reflect the drop in immigration recently that's come out. So when we do use the Ministry of Finance projections in our official plan, we can do that with adjustments as well. So these applications have just used the Ministry of Finance numbers straight up in terms of their assessments. That's why they're higher.
Thank you, Dave. We have a question about the subwatershed study that was mentioned previously, and if that study and subwatershed studies in general also consider the impacts on surrounding lands, or are they just focused on those development envelopes?
Jim Harnum, project manager of stormwater here. Yes, so the subwatershed study, it directly analyzes the impacts or potential impacts and mitigation measures on the specific subject lands, as well as a buffer area on receiving systems and nearby lands as well. The extent of that, it depends on the application, but there are ministry guidelines from the Ministry of Environment on the scope of kind of the extent of review of those subwatershed studies and how far out you need to look on the reaches there. Mark, do you have anything else to add?
No, I think, Jim, that Mark Hartley, senior engineer for stormwater, I think that covers it, Jim. Quite well. It's I think the emphasis there is on just trying to find the relationship between the site and the surrounding watershed.
Thank you, gentlemen. Next is a question for transportation. So it's relating particularly, well, it's calling out that traffic is high in the area, in many areas around the city, but it's specifically looking at the accesses up and down the escarpment, I believe is where we're going with this. And there are already sort of these funnels with some additional population coming, is there consideration for those accesses and some of these, we'll call them funnels that exist on the mountain community in Hamilton?
So Steve Malloy, Manager of Transportation Planning. Again, my team is responsible for reviewing the transportation impacts. Not dissimilar to the Whitechurch comments, we would have to, as part of our review, look at the upstream and downstream impact.
We lost Steve, so we'll give him a minute to come back, and then we can resume chatting about transportation. There is a question here, though, as well. There's been a lot of discussion around the developer funding the required infrastructure within the subject lands, but where or how do we account for the cost of upgrades in other parts of the system?
I think I can take that. Neil Gavin Norman, Manager of Infrastructure Planning and Growth Management, Planning and Economic Development. As it stands right now, local infrastructure required to support lands outside the urban boundary will need to be paid by developers or development charges bylaw. Include specific provisions for any infrastructure needed outside the current urban boundary will not be supported financially by the city. Good question. What happens when you get inside the urban boundary, and if sewers need to be bigger, water mains need to be bigger, a treatment plant needs to be have a higher capacity. Those issues haven't been fully figured out in terms of how they might be paid for, but there definitely will be a development charge component to pay for those larger citywide type facilities. So definitely there would be a development charge component for the developers to pay per unit for the capacity requirements at the plant, the water treatment plants. But that, as it relates to a larger, say, sewer downstream of the escarpment, that it'd be expected that the developers would have to pay for an upsizing of that as well. But again, those details, we're not there yet, but there is indication from the approval of the development charges bylaw is that any infrastructure upgrades required for development outside the current urban boundary would not be covered by the city financially.
Thank you for that, Gavin. I'm just checking. I don't think we have Steve back. So we'll move on again, and we'll make sure we circle back for some of those questions on transportation. I'm going to note there are a couple questions that are coming in around the ability to review some of these documents or able to get into some more detail on those. They are available on the city's Urban Boundary Expansion webpage. It's referenced a few times, was in the presentation materials, but I'll be honest, I always find it by Googling Urban Boundary Expansion Hamilton, and it's usually the first hit. So for those of you who are looking to get into those detailed studies, they are available online. I see Steve is back, so we're going to go back to Steve to talk about some of those funnels in the transportation system on the mountain.
My sincere apologies to everyone. I guess I had some glitching on my end. So I'm going to just keep my camera off just to keep my bandwidth. Just to respond back to the question, I'll start from the beginning, and not dissimilar to the question that was asked during the Whitechurch lands. Our review would look at the existing capacity constraints and our planned road network north and south. So looking at, as suggested, the north-south routes being Upper Centennial, Upper Red Hill Valley Parkway, the Red Hill Valley Parkway, as well as escarpment crossings, and understanding from the analysis that's provided what deficiencies in the network would be identified through this work. So that would be part of our overall assessment of the upstream and downstream impacts, both north, south, and east and west.
Thank you for that, Steve. We have another, quite a few questions actually about stormwater. So I'm going to look to Jim here to start. But the questions are largely looking at this idea that stormwater management techniques need to be considered early. So maybe if we can get a little bit of commentary on where in the process those are considered. But then also there's some questions about some maybe on-site or some low impact retention ponds and swales and things like that, and how those function within the greater system before that stormwater is sort of entering traditional storm sewers?
Thanks, Neil. Jim Harnum, Project Manager of Stormwater in the Infrastructure Planning Group. Yes, so essentially, I guess I'll answer the second part of that question first, which is when we are looking at evaluating these applications, we are looking to see what kind of strategies are proposed at this stage right now, and what those kind of measures are, both from a mitigation of climate change as well as handling the stormwater events that we're talking about. So we are looking to see commentary around things like low impact development, which I believe was mentioned, and we are looking at the strategies that are proposed, such as the retention ponds and those kinds of classic stormwater management strategies. We are currently still, as we mentioned earlier, reviewing those and the scope and the scale of the proposal. And there is some commentary from the applicant around further details being provided at the secondary planning stage. So we are reviewing what's provided now and providing our commentary and recommendations to go into that recommendation report to council. Neil, could you just remind me what the first part of that question was?
So where in the review stage do we start considering stormwater? And then, what other checkpoints are there along the way?
Okay. Yeah. So this part of the review, so this early part of the review, the urban boundary expansion application, we are looking at the stormwater management strategies right now. As Dave had mentioned, we've in the draft urban boundary framework, we do request the phase 1 subwatershed study. And additionally, the functional servicing report is also intended to speak to these stormwater management strategies from a high level or a functional level. So what we're looking for at this time is essentially, can the applicant demonstrate that they have thoroughly thought about the strategies that are available to them and demonstrated the applicability for those strategies on these subject lands. So those are the kinds of things we're looking for at this stage. And then, as I'd mentioned, if or when this goes through to a secondary planning stage, that's when we would expect to see more details, such as sizing of stormwater management blocks and some of those more comprehensive details that would be expected to kind of understand the design of it. But yes, we are absolutely looking at stormwater management at this stage and expect to see those in the applications.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Jim. We have some timeline questions popping up again, not dissimilar to some of the questions that were asked in the White Church session. But I'm wondering, Dave, if you could provide an overview again of what some anticipated timelines are, and maybe highlight some of the uncertainties in trying to answer when ground will be broken or when infrastructure would be installed.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Neil. So as I mentioned, June 25th is a time of when the public meetings will be held and the recommendation reports considered by planning committee and then subsequently right after by council. That is to fit within the 120-day Planning Act window where we have to make a decision or the applicant can appeal a non-decision to the Ontario Land Tribunal. And let's say whatever council's position is, the applicant, if they don't agree with council's position, can appeal that to the Ontario Land Tribunal as well. These are large hearings. The hearing coming up for the appeal on 20 Road West urban expansion is, I think, 8 weeks, and it's a year out from now. These applications, especially Elfrida, given its size, etc., but at White Church as well, will be at least that time frame, if not quite a bit more. And when you have to set aside that amount of time, the logistics puts the hearing dates out far. So, I mean, that's not something I have control over or anything like that, but ultimately it usually takes a while. And I use the example of 20 Road West being a hearing of 8 weeks and a year out from now. So you can imagine the length of time likely for our Elfrida and Whitechurch applications before they would be considered by the tribunal if appealed. And let's say they are, then that hearing happens. That's obviously down the road, as I mentioned. That hearing takes a while. Then you wait for a decision. That can take some time as well. From the tribunal on an application of this size, you could be looking at several months for a decision to be made potentially. And then once that decision's made, should there be an approval for the lands to come into the urban boundary at that stage, then you're looking at secondary planning that has to be done, studies done and associated with that secondary plan, which is a blueprint for how that community would grow and develop should they come into the urban boundary. The further sub-watershed planning work has to be done, etc. And probably at that point in time, there has to be a look at the water wastewater master planning as well, because the master planning that's ongoing right now is for the existing urban boundary. It doesn't look at the expansion areas. So that work would have to be done, which could affect the phasing of the land and the secondary planning work as well. So you're looking probably at a few years out before anything happens for sure, development wise.
Gavin, you have some follow-up there?
Yeah, thanks, Neil. And just to add to Dave's comments about how long it can take to develop, and given we're into the stage of reviewing applications, there's likely Ontario Land Tribunal period of time that they refer to, and then if anything gets approved, we got secondary planning, and then we got things like plans of subdivision approvals as part of the development form being defined, as well as all the infrastructure that's required to support it, and then ultimately to get to construction and that point, even getting to building houses. Using Dave's guide of how long things can take, and what I know about developing land in Hamilton and elsewhere in the province is it could be easily 8 to 10 years out before you see a house going up. There's lots of work to do in terms of engineering approvals, but also building a core infrastructure to support what's going to be houses being developed. So
Right.
Again, it's not 3 years from now, it's not 5 years, you're really looking at 8 to 10 years out before you start to see anything.
Perfect. Thanks for that additional context. We've had some conversations tonight about agriculture, and we've called out a few different natural heritage features, but we've had some questions about other things that might be protected within these developments. So I think we're looking to, what constitutes potentially a core area within the natural heritage system within the city, and also down the road, should one of these developers choose to amend those designations, specifically the ones that are currently listed as natural heritage, what does that process look like, and what does that review look like?
So we have some information submitted with the applications on natural heritage now, and we have to look at and assess that. So there's going to be a level of assessment on what they're proposing relative to natural heritage, maybe what policy protection measures they've put in their own individual and specific official plan amendments. We'll have to look at that as well. So depending on the approval and what happens, at a decision of council, and then subsequently, if there's an appeal to the Ontario Land Tribunal, there's going to be, obviously, natural heritage is going to come up as a priority area that has to be addressed in terms of looking at the application. Should it come into the urban boundary, I think it depends on how it comes into the urban boundary, what policies are associated with it. But as I mentioned, the existing secondary planning policies we have in the official plan, which were developed when the province added lands to the urban boundary. The city undertook an official plan amendment to guide how development would happen in those areas. Then they were subsequently removed by the province. Those secondary plan policies are still in place. I talked about them in the presentation, and natural heritage protection and climate change are two of kind of the objectives that we want addressed at the secondary planning stage. That's under the existing policies. So at that stage as well, there'd have to be assessment of natural heritage and looking at the existing policies and the provincial planning statement policies on natural heritage protection would all have to be considered at that stage as well.
Mark, I think you have some additional commentary.
Yes, thanks. Mark Hartley, Senior Engineer for Stormwater Management. Just commenting about how connected these days stormwater management is to natural heritage. I just wanted to add to what David said, is that as part of the review process, I heard in part of the question about species, and so that made me think, just wanted to mention to people that it's also very important at this stage of the process that various endangered threatened species at both designated by both the province and the federal government are also things that need to be considered, and part of the applications. They have started that process in terms of identifying whether they've been able to identify things like various birds, amphibians, frogs, turtles, that kind of thing. So that's part of the process.
Thank you for that, Mark. There is a question asking about a single point of contact for impacted residents during the review and construction. I think as we heard, construction, we don't have a plan for that yet. It's very far into the future, but through this review phase and the multi sort of faceted level of this that is planning through this initial phase, future OLT or future potential OLT hearings, the secondary planning phase, so on and so forth. There is a dedicated group that is dealing with these applications on behalf of the city, and that's that urban boundary at hamilton.ca email address. So that's your primary point of contact, not just for questions and comments between now and the recommendation report, but also moving forward. That group is there and able to answer your questions for these applications, but ones you might see in the future as well. We do have a question here inquiring what our Indigenous consultation looks like for these applications. Maybe what has already happened, what's intended to happen, and so forth. So I'll pass that to you, Dave.
So in the framework, we've encouraged the applicant to reach out prior to making the applications. I think there has been some reaching out prior to the applications coming in, and the applicant is subsequently having discussions with First Nations, as well as we circulate First Nations the applications and provide the opportunity for comment as well.
There's a few questions about forests and how they're treated within this planning process and where they fit in maybe relative to things like agriculture and wetlands that we've already had a chance to discuss. So I don't know, Dave, maybe if you have a little bit of commentary on where those fit into our natural heritage system and the policy framework there.
So, woodlands, significant woodlands are part of the core area as wetlands are, etc. And those are factors that should be considered in the natural heritage work at this stage in terms of like constraints analysis and kind of how significant they generally are and where they are, and some direction as to how they could be protected as you move along. So that is something we'll be assessing, whether that is sufficient, what other comments we might have in terms of their protection if the application were to move further along in the approval processes.
Thank you, Dave. We also have a question just about this development in particular and their design level. I'm not sure we have these details yet, but are there proposed to be multi-story buildings within the development? Or do we have a breakdown of what types of units they might be proposing?
Thanks, Neil. I think for the Elfrida application, it's quite conceptual at this point in time, and I think there's some the application concerns includes some kind of conceptual renderings as to what some of the housing types could look like as examples, which I think might be of interest to whoever made the comment or question online to take a look at to give an idea. There's some kind of broad-based, this form of lower density, higher or medium density type residential conceptually, and then there's some conceptual examples of what that development could look like. That would be refined more should the application come into the urban boundary at the secondary planning stage.
Thank you, Dave. We're starting to wind down some of the general questions. I'm not sure if those in the room have some more they want to get in the next few minutes. We still have about 15 minutes to answer questions. If you have a question that was entered and we didn't get to it, I do welcome you to resubmit. I am looking at a long line of questions here, some marked answered, some have been answered other ways. So please, in this last 15 minutes, if you do have some of those questions, feel free to get those in. So there is a question asking if there's an example or if anyone on the call has an example of what a medium density area might look like sort of within the current urban boundary to help people visualize that type of development.
I think, Neil, like as I mentioned, I would go by more along the lines of what the applicant is kind of visioning for their application, as opposed to maybe examples within the existing urban area, and take a look at some of the conceptual material provided by the applicant in that regard.
Sure. So to the person who asked that question, those materials are available online, and they do have some information relating to what types of development they would be looking for there. There's a question here about, all natural heritage features, including wetlands and forests, are valuable and maybe becoming more valuable in a climate emergency. This individual is also indicating that the Hamilton Mountain is lacking in some of these municipally required green spaces. So what steps are taken within this review to protect those existing ones, and maybe a little bit of commentary on what we could expect in some new green spaces that would be associated with some of these developments, at least at a high level.
Sure. Our official plan places a priority on protection of core natural heritage features and their protection. And we're going to obviously take our official plan policies into consideration, as well as the provincial planning statement on protection of significant woodlands and wetlands, etc. In terms of assessing it. All this is still under assessment. So in terms of reviewing all their material that's been submitted, and we're going to take all that into consideration in terms of making recommendations.
Thank you, Dave. We have two questions back to back that are actually very similar, just at different scales. So I'm going to kind of merge them together. But the question sort of calls out this idea of urban boundary expansion has many negative impacts and does not appear to align with some of the broader goals of the city or the province regarding climate change, protecting agriculture, and so forth. How do we balance some of those priorities, and maybe what are some of the benefits or policy priorities that developments of this nature do bring to the table?
Sure. Thanks for that question. So as we talked about for both the White Church and the Elfrida applications, we went through some city official plan policies that are pertinent in terms of the review, and the urban boundary expansion framework has kind of questions that we're going to look at in terms of arriving at conclusions on the applications, right? For each kind of topic area, servicing has its questions on like the provincial planning statement on whether there's sufficient existing or planned capacity to accommodate the development. That's something we have to take into consideration, right? As well as our own official plan policies, we have to consider those. Those are council direction that's provided in the official plan. So obviously we have to consider those at arriving at a conclusion. And was there a second part to that? Sorry, Neil.
So it was really, we've had a lot of conversation about the negatives and how they maybe don't align with some of those provincial and municipal goals. So the second part was what parts of these development do contribute to those goals that are maybe offsetting that.
Right. So, the applications would point to the fact of providing a greater supply of housing that's in a different form, like more ground-based housing that potentially might not be able to be provided as much in the existing urban area. There could be an argument of bringing that housing online could help with affordability of housing. I mean, in terms of that is something we'd take a look at to see if it does or doesn't. And the fiscal impact assessment for the applications talked about at build out, there's a net gain to the city after considering tax revenue and infrastructure being paid for by development charges versus what the costs are to the city to provide, but that's at build out. So we have to analyze those fiscal impact assessments relative to is there a cost to the city until it reaches full build out or close to full build out. So that is something we have to take into consideration when we analyze the applications. But certainly there's an alternative form of housing provided. There's an opportunity to plan on a complete community perspective because there is kind of a blank canvas in terms of planning on a complete community where, in the urban area, we do secondary planning and there's all the logistics of all the existing development out there. There is some existing development, obviously, in these expansion areas, but not to the same extent. So that's an advantage from that perspective. But ultimately, we look at this relative to the provincial planning statement. We look at it relative to the city's urban growth strategy and the existing policies in the official plan and what the desired goals are, as well as we look at the urban boundary expansion framework and those kind of key questions we had in there to really take a look at providing a comprehensive review as to what impact this has on the city in general in terms of the expansion.
Thank you, Dave. So we are winding into the last 5 minutes of our Q&A here. maybe serendipitously, there is a question here about what steps have already been taken to ensure meaningful public consultation. How will those comments be incorporated into the planning process? And then maybe if there's can highlight some of the future opportunities that people will have to engage with this material and provide comments as well.
Okay, right. So first of all, as we've said from the beginning, these are privately initiated urban boundary expansion applications. These are not, this is not a city project. This is not a city municipal comprehensive review or a city initiated application to expand the urban boundaries. These are privately initiated urban boundary expansions allowed through provincial changes to legislation. Okay. We have timelines, as I mentioned, to review those applications, 120 days from when the materials were submitted as complete. And that puts us to the beginning of July. So we have a limited amount of limited period of time for consultation. What I would say is, you know, with the framework we had as draft when these applications came in, we did apply that as best we could for guidance. The applicants have held their own virtual open houses. We've held 2 open houses hosted by the city, one at, you know, downtown here, and the other one virtually tonight. We are gathering all that comments, and comments we receive up to April 28th. We will incorporate in the report. We'll actually attach all those comments. What I'm envisioning is obviously those will redact personal information, etc. We'll have charts that list the comment and perhaps another column as to how the comment's addressed, as well as we'll theme the comments for the report itself in terms of the body of the report, and speak to like the really key kind of comments that are really important that have been themed and how we're addressing those, as well as we have to factor in under the Planning Act, we circulate agencies as well. We get their comments. We're looking, obviously, we've circulated First Nations, we get their comments. In terms of consultation and providing the opportunity to get the message out, signs have been posted around the subject lands. Probably more signs will be going up over some time. We circulated everyone within the subject lands and within 400 meters from the subject lands as well. And we put the notification of the open houses in the paper as well. So we've tried to reach out as best we can. We also have a email blast, so to speak, of people that we send notification to that were on the grids to work back when there was all the analysis of how Hamilton should grow for the official plan that was adopted by the city. And that grids 2 list has been used and it's been expanded on, etc. And we do email blasts for that. So we've tried to reach out from a consultation perspective as much as we can for private applications that we have a time limit on. There's also the opportunity to write in for the public meeting and as well come and state your position or concerns at the public meeting on June 25th for each application.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Dave. And I'll plug it one more time. If we haven't got to your question this evening, if you have comments, if you have an opportunity to go through all those detailed reports that are available online, and you have additional questions or comments, please do reach out to planning staff at that email, urbanboundary@hamilton.ca. Even beyond that April 28th date, your comments might not be able to be formally included in the recommendation report at this juncture, but as we've heard tonight, there is lots of work ongoing, and there is opportunity to have your input on those proceedings as well. So we are now at 9 p.m., which is the intended end of our event. So I want to thank everyone who did come out and ask questions, pose comments to us. We have recorded and we are tracking all of those. I want to thank our panelists who are here tonight from various groups, and we're able to miss out on this fine Thursday evening and provide all those questions, and to all the members of the public as well who chose to sit with us and talk about development and urban boundary expansions rather than enjoying that sunshine this evening. So with that, I'll maybe hand it over to Dave for a final goodbye, but thank you to everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. I myself thank everybody for their participation on this. It's really important for us to hear back from the community. This is not only affects the people around that live in proximity to the urban boundary expansions, but is a citywide issue of interest. So we do thank everyone for their participation. Like Neil said, we're gathering all the questions, comments, and concerns so that we can incorporate them into the recommendation report. And just once again, thank you for your participation and wish everybody a happy long weekend.
Thanks, Dave.